Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about LGBT poetry. I love reading poetry, and there's so much content out there by queer writers. So today I wanted to highlight a few books that I have read and absolutely enjoyed. These are not going to be in any particular order of enjoyment or anything like that, but I do want to start out with a couple of books that I think would be good, especially if you're starting out and aren't really used to reading poetry. If you're more familiar with reading young adult literature, a really good place to start is David Levithan. David Levithan has actually written a ton of regular young adult novels, but he does have several poetry collections. The Realm of Possibilities reads a little bit more like a story. Each poem is told from a different person's perspective. I think we get 2 poems per perspective, but one's in the first half of the book and one's in the second. It has been several years since I've read this, but I remember really enjoying it. This is one of the first books that I read that you actually got to see the perspective of a queer person, and I'm pretty sure this book or another David Levithan book is one of the first own voices queer novels that I got to read. The other poetry book of his that I have is The Lover's Dictionary. This one is set up a little bit differently. Some of it's poetry, some of it is just kind of short snippets of dialogue. It's not exactly one whole story, like you can tell the Realm of Possibilities, they're all sort of talking about a similar event. But The Lover's Dictionary is a good book and probably a good introduction to poetry if you're used to young adult. Regardless of what genre you're used to reading, How Poetry Can Change Your Heart is a absolutely wonderful introduction to poetry. Even if you are a seasoned poetry reader, this is a wonderful book to have. It does talk about some of the mechanics of poetry, but the majority of it is really about the feelings that poetry can give you and how you can find that poetic beauty in other places as well. So it's good for readers as well as writers. I absolutely fell in love with this book. How Poetry Can Change Your Heart is written by Andrea Gibson and Megan Fowley. I haven't heard as much from Megan Fowley, but Andrea Gibson is one of my all-time favorites. They share snippets of poetry from both of the authors in here, but really the majority of this book isn't written in poetry, it's mostly talking about poetry. Even if you don't care that much about poetry, I feel like this perspective is just really enriching in a lot of ways. I'll go ahead and continue on that vein, talking about Andrea Gibson. Andrea Gibson has a number of poetry collections. A lot of them are actually available on Scribd, so if you have that, please go download a couple of their books. They talk about their experiences of gender and sexuality, mental illness, chronic illness. They also talk about feminism and white privilege. There's just so much packed into these little books, and their writing is absolutely beautiful. The next LGBT poet that I'm going to be talking about is Alok Fayed Menon. This is Alok's only poetry collection, as far as I know, Femme in Public. I have nothing but positive things to say about Alok. Throughout their poetry, they speak on their experiences of oppression, homophobia, transphobia, racism, and really how they're all connected together. So much of their work is focused on wholly and unapologetically accepting yourself despite the things that society says that you should hate about yourself. Next, I'd like to talk about Queer Heartache by Kit Yan. In this book, Kit Yan talks about his experiences with gender, sex and sexuality, and he also highlights his experiences growing up Asian American and also growing up in a poor part of the city. This is such a great poetry collection. It's actually been a little while since I read it, so I am planning on rereading it for Pride Month. Next, I'm going to be talking about Danez Smith. These are the 2 poetry collections that I have read by them. They focus a whole lot on race, sexuality, gender, and being HIV positive. One of my favorite things about their work is how they can interweave their own individual experience with community experience, and it is simultaneously the same thing and different. Honestly, I won't go into any more detail, just please pick up this book. Don't Call Us Dead is actually the best poetry book that I've read all year. The next poet that I'll be talking about is Fariha Rosine, who wrote How to Cure a Ghost. In this book, she talks a lot about family, religion, relationships, and also sexuality. This is a really beautiful set of poems. She talks a lot about different kind of traumas, both personal and group traumas. I really loved this poetry collections. There were a lot of hard-hitting one-liners in particular, but all of these pieces are really beautiful when viewed together. In the book, she talks about a lot of different topics, but they are weaved together really beautifully. The last book that I'm going to be talking about is a classic that absolutely transcends time, and that is Sappho's works. The edition that I have read is If Not Winter, Fragments of Sappho. I don't have other translations to compare this to yet. However, I really enjoyed the way that Anne Carson translated this and the way that she set this up. One of the big things that sets this translation apart is the fact that she actually annotates where the parchment is broken and distorted. I've read in a few different places where this is probably the most kind of direct translation. She doesn't really take a lot of poetic liberties necessarily, but there are a lot of footnotes, so you can see why she translated what, and it kind of gives you a little bit of perspective on what they might have meant. Additionally, they also have the English on one side and the original Greek on the other, which I can't read Greek. However, it's still really interesting to get to see it side by side. So many of these poems really deeply touched me, and I was honestly kind of surprised because these poems are very old. A lot of them are incomplete, or even the ones that aren't incomplete, most of them are pretty small. But I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Right before I read this, I read the second book that I mentioned, How Poetry Can Change Your Heart, and I think that really made my experience reading Sappho that much better. The main thing that I learned from reading If Not Winter is that gay yearning has not changed since the beginning of time. So these are the queer poets that I wanted to share with you today. If you enjoy reading poetry, definitely let me know who your favorite LGBT poet is down in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching. Bye!